In Abraham's life, everything seems to go wrong. And just when things started to turn around, this happened. As you're watching this podcast, Making Great Saints, probably you are curious and even intrigued about what this is all about, making great saints. And in particular, what does it have to do with my life? Well, today we will be looking at Abraham, profile of a great saint. And maybe in watching this episode, you will come to see certain things that apply very, very closely to you. First and foremost, from Abraham's example, you will find that you have been created in God's image and likeness, and that this decision is a perfect decision on God's part. And so, through your ups and downs in life, your challenges and difficulties, God will always be with you because you are His image and likeness. And through it all, He will bring you to where He has always wanted you to be, namely in deep union with Him. And you will come to understand that outside of God, your life is chaotic, is disordered, you are loaded and laden with sin, and the decisions you make are not always the best for you. Whereas with God, however great your trials and tribulations might be, you will live above the fray even while you are deeply immersed in it. So let's look at Abraham. His name was Abram, and he lived in the country of Haran, which is present day northwest Syria and southeast Turkey. He had moved there with his family from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in southern Iraq, about 600 miles. So that was indeed a long journey, and definitely God prepared him for this. So now he is in the land of Haran, and God appears to him and asks to be in covenant union with him. What then is covenant? Covenant is when two parties come together and they pledge their lives to each other through promises. So God makes two very significant promises to Abram. That's his name, until God changes it to Abraham when Abram truly has become a covenant partner. God makes two promises. One, I will give you much wealth, plenty of property, but you will have to travel 600 miles to the land of Canaan. And secondly, I will give you descendants as many as the stars in the heavens and the sands on the seashore. These are huge promises. Will God be a promise keeper? On Abram's part, he has to leave his land, his home, his family, everything that is dear to him, and do God's bidding. And so, in the very beginning of this relationship, you see that Abram is very faithful to God. He does exactly as God asks him. He travels 600 miles with his wife Sarah. He's 75 years old. As yet, they have no children. So, this is a promise. And as I said, Abram and Sarai still don't have any children. So they come to Canaan, and the first thing that Abram does is he erects an altar and he offers God a sacrifice in thanksgiving and basically strengthening his faith and trust in God. And God then reiterates his promise. So now Abram is living there and he becomes very, very wealthy along with his nephew Lot, to the point where they can no longer live together because of the huge flocks of cattle and sheep and goats that they have. So Abram tells Lot, you decide which direction you wish to take to settle with your family, and I'll take the other side. So Lot, with his family, travels south, which is in the direction of present day Dead Sea. And Abram then is living separately from Lot. He is now 85 years old and he still has no children. And you can see in these 10 years, he has been wondering whether God will truly keep his promise. So then God appears to him, takes him out of his tent, and shows him the heavens and points to the stars and says, just as you see these stars, that's how many will be your descendants. Abram is not convinced. You can see at this point he's struggling to trust God, to believe that God truly is a promise keeper. And so he says to God very honestly and transparently, you know, I'm 85 years old, I don't have children. And wouldn't it be a grand shame that when I died, I would have to hand everything over to Eliezer, my head servant, because I have no progeny to hand everything to. That's when God says, let us do a covenant ritual. And it's a very solemn covenant ritual because Abram is asked to slaughter three animals: a heifer, a ram, and a lamb, which he does, and he places the split parts, creating a passageway between them. And in the tradition, both parties then would walk up one way, down the other through the split parts, and then they would splash the blood of the dead animals on each other to signify covenant union because now they are sharing the same life. When God appears, Abram is cast into a deep sleep, which is another way of saying that God has appeared. And only God walks through the split parts to remind Abram that he is a promise keeper and he will stay faithful to his promises, even though Abram is struggling and grappling with all these doubts. So you see, he is in our human condition like all of us. Life is not clear, and yet he is somewhat assured by God's promise, and yet not quite. Because then the next step that Abram takes along with his wife Sarai, she convinces him that it would be much better for her to have children from him, but not from her, but rather through her maidservant Hagar. So you can see Sarai has not laughed in many years because she has had no joy. She has experienced her barrenness as a curse. And in these very trying circumstances, she's trying to come up with a solution. And so clearly they have reservations, they have doubts about God. And so they act on their doubts. Abram takes Hagar as his concubine and has a child from her, a son whom he names Ishmael. And of course, that then creates tremendous friction between Sarai and Hagar. And Hagar uh, taunts her, uh, disdains her, makes life very difficult for her to the point where Sarai tells Abram, you'll have to choose between her and me. And then Abram decides to ask Hagar, along with Ishmael, to leave. So you can see they're living in very, very trying circumstances. That's when God appears to him again and reiterates his promise. And at this point, as Abram has fallen on his face in adoration of God, in this conversation, Abram makes a suggestion to God. You know, why are you bothering about giving me a son of your promise? Why don't you take Ishmael and make him the son of your promise? This will be much easier for you, and this will be much easier for us. Of course, Abram didn't realize that it would be excruciatingly difficult for Sarai. And that's when God tells Abram, I made you a promise, and this son that I'm talking about, Sarai will bear this son, and I will be truly a promise keeper. That is when God sends Abram and Sarai to messengers on his behalf. But just before that, he then asks Abram to enter into a covenant union with him through circumcision. And so all the males in the family and in the clan have been circumcised. And that is when God, to make even more clear that he will stick to his promises, he changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah, thereby making it very clear from now on they are covenant partners and they can trust God completely. That's when the messengers from God reassure Abraham and Sarah that next year by this time, now they give them a very clear timeline. Next year by this time, Sarah will give birth to a son. And so you can see Abraham and Sarai have been moved gradually, but with God consistently, see, toward learning how to trust God, toward believing that God is a promise keeper. And sure enough, next year at that very time, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And so there's great rejoicing and there's great celebration. And now they understand that indeed God has been, is, and will ever be a promise keeper. And that they can truly give him their total allegiance and obedience to whatever he asks of them. So then they have another 12 years of wonderful joy and peace and are living an ecstatic life. We are told that Sarah now can laugh. She is no longer needing to feel humiliated and embarrassed because the curse has been lifted. She now can rejoice because she is a mother and she can finally give Abraham what he so much desired and would cherish, namely a son. And Abraham, on his part, sees then that God, from this son, will raise descendants as many as the stars in the heavens. That is when God says to Abraham, see, I have proven to you to be a true promise keeper and a true covenant partner. I have been your God in every way. And so you have now arrived at the position where you have accepted me as God, and you will do my bidding without questioning anymore. And so then God tells Abraham, he puts him to the test, and he says, I want you to sacrifice your son, Isaac. And we are told that Abraham says, I am ready. It's amazing that at this point, Abraham doesn't question God whatsoever. We are not told whether he revealed this to Sarah or not. And so Abraham obeys God without questioning, knowing that God, who is the God of love and goodness, whatever he asks will not lead to evil, even though it might appear to be so. And so he says yes to God, knowing that God will bring about his plan, which will always be for the best, and it will always be for the good of Abraham and his wife Sarah. So he follows God's command and he goes all the way to Mount Moriah, which is in the environs of present day Jerusalem. And on the way, you can see that Isaac and Abraham are being described as priests because they are involved in a sacrifice. And a sacrifice always means it's pointing toward a covenant. The one sacrificing is basically saying, I am doing this on behalf of the animal being sacrificed who represents the other party. In this case, it would be Abraham and Isaac. And basically saying that just as God has given himself over to them completely, they are going to do the same through the sacrifice. How do we know that both Abraham and Isaac now are being described as priests? Because Abraham has the knife to sacrifice the animal, and Isaac has the wood. He clearly is the Christ figure, carrying the cross to Mount Moriah, on which mount Solomon built his temple. And on the way, Isaac asks his dad, his father, uh, we are going to sacrifice, to do a sacrifice on Mount Moriah, but where is the animal? Abraham does not lie to his son. He says, God will provide. And so they come to Mount Moriah, and as he is about to slay his son, that is when he is stopped by the angel who points into the bushes and tells him, there is a ram, I want you to sacrifice the lamb. And here clearly, Abraham is a God the Father figure. God was telling us already far in advance that, like Abraham, he would be the father who would have his son sacrificed on the cross, on Mount Moriah, on Mount Calvary, on our behalf. So, as you witness this journey, you see very clearly that God has moved Abraham, and Sarah incrementally, consistently, without let up, uh, being very involved in their lives, in the history of their lives, and moving them to incredible heights of union with God, of transformation, so that Abraham now is seen as the father of all nations. And then in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, the author pays wonderful, amazing tribute to Abraham when he says, Abraham knew that if he had to sacrifice his son Isaac, God would still give him children. Abraham's faith never faltered. Your faith and mine too will never falter if you and I decide to have God in our lives, to have God abiding in us, to listen to God as He liberates us from our burden of sin and doubt and confusion and chaos. and brings us into his life so that, like Abraham and Sarah, we will be then in the process of becoming great saints. God bless you.
Making Great Saints is made possible by Our Ladies Healing Center and God's Embrace Ministries. For more information on Our Ladies Healing Center's healing program, visit OurLadiesHealingCenter.com. For ongoing formation and daily discipleship through God's Embrace Ministries, visit godsembrace.org.